On this episode of Booked on Rock, author Sean Egan explores Bob Dylan's 1960s music that shaped rock and culture. From iconic albums like Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde, to timeless songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Like a Rolling Stone, we cover it all next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. This episode's guest is Sean Egan. He's the author of Decade of Descent, How 1960s Bob Dylan Changed the World. Thank you for being here, Sean.
No problem.
Going back to when Dylan arrives on the scene in late 1961, early 62, what little we know about Bob Dylan through Columbia Records, press releases, and early interviews is that he's, quote, a young man whose rambunctiousness stemmed from the grievances of material underprivilege. But over time, we would find out that wasn't the true story. What was Dylan's early life like, and how would that provide the impetus to his early songs like Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, and The Times They Are A-Changin'?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly can't be described as being materially underprivileged. He came from a middle-class household up in Hibbing, Minnesota. His dad owned a furniture store, and he never wanted for anything. I mean, he was driving cars and motorbikes when he was still a teenager. So on that score, it was certainly a lie that he span to early interviewers. That does seem to be bound up in a certain unhappiness with his hinterland. His dad was quite an authoritarian figure. Seems to have got on okay with his mum and his grandmother as well. But there's some deep-seated anguish and grievance on Dylan's part towards his dad. And that does seem to be manifested in the songs that he started writing in the early 60s, the protest songs. It was basically, in his early days, maybe his entire life, he was very anti-authoritarianism, anti-racism, and he had sympathy for the underdog. His dad used to have to repossess furniture that he'd sold to people on hire purchase, and Dylan had to go and help retrieve that furniture. And that was one of the most hated aspects of his childhood. He absolutely detested having to do that. And that seems to be the perfect summary of how, despite the fact that he was privileged, he had sympathy always for the underprivileged.
Dylan's self-titled debut was released in March of 1962. Dylan known as an original songwriter, but that first album, mostly cover songs, 11 covers, 2 originals, and there are contrasting perceptions of its quality. What are those contrasting perceptions?
Well, it was quite well received at the time, and it was quite well liked. I mean, people like the Animals, the UK R&B group, and Rod Stewart in his early days when he was a folkie, they loved it. And it's got good reviews down the years. The Rolling Stone, the first Rolling Stone record guide, if you remember that, they put it higher in its rankings than The Times They Are A-Changin', which is a much more famous album. But it's an odd album, not just because we now perceive Dylan as his talent as being an original songwriter, and there's only a couple of new songs on the record. It's also contains a lot of songs about being an old man looking back on life and having lived a long life of hardship and getting ready to meet his maker. I mean, that runs like a seam through the album. And this is a kid who's still got puppy fat on his cheeks and certainly hasn't lived a hard life materially. So that it just seems that Dylan was trying to get his grievances off his chest, and not having the artistic wherewithal at the time to do that. He was choosing to cover songs which he felt somehow addressed his grievances. So it's a joker in the pack, and it's certainly not representative of anything we perceive about Bob Dylan these days.
The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan was released in late May 1963, where the original had 11 covers, 2 originals. This has 11 originals, 2 covers. The opening track, Blowin' in the Wind, it became an anthem for Dylan's generation. You write, quote, "The only line that doesn't have a question mark at the end of it is the one that appears at the close of each verse, which states that the answer to the preceding litany of enquiries is blowing in the wind." In other words, the narrator is saying merely "beats me, pal," or as the British would put it, "don't ask me, mate." That's from the book. Non-committal and ambiguous, the suspicious minds may assume he was pulling a fast one on his listeners, but others say he's questioning humanity and in a sense saying that we need to wake up to the reality that war and oppression can be avoided. What is your interpretation of the lyrics?
Well, people think that some people think that he was only inspired to write protest songs by his girlfriend at the time, Susie Rotolo, who was a bit of a left-wing activist. But you can't really fake that kind of passion and commitment and the kind of songs that he was writing, the emotion behind them. "Blowing in the Wind" is probably a bit unrepresentative in its ambiguity. He lists injustices and he says, "What's the answer? How many times can the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned?" Well, the answer is blowing in the wind. So it's ambiguous. And if he'd only written that one protest song, we could say, well, he leaves himself open to the suspicion that it was all fake. But of course, something like "The Times They Are A-Changing" or "When the Ship Comes In" or "Masters of War," I mean, those are pretty straightforward declarations of seething hatred to the perpetrators of injustice. So that's in no way phony whatsoever. And the interesting thing about "Blowing in the Wind," of course, is that he wrote it mere weeks or months after the Bob Dylan album was recorded. So he suddenly blossomed into this great songwriter. He was suddenly writing songs destined to be world famous. It's not just that, of course. It's stuff like "A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall" and material like that, "Masters of War." Suddenly he made this transformation. It must be one of the most extraordinary development growth bursts in the history of recorded music.
Talk about Dylan's importance in terms of how he would shape the way that we would receive pop music from this point on.
Well, that kind of sophistication and intellect and political commitment was not unusual within folk music, but the crucial thing happened in 1965 when he merged folk and rock stroke pop together. I mean, that had never been done before, simply because it never occurred to anybody that the kind of people who listened to folk would be interested in songs with a backbeat in 4/4 time and decorated with pretty instrumentation or raucous instrumentation. And of course, vice versa. There was no reason to believe that the people who bought Beatles and Stones records or had bought Elvis records in the past would be interested in listening to songs that were either political or written in a poetic style. But he merged the two successfully together. People today don't quite understand just how revolutionary that is, because within a very short space of time, it became absolutely commonplace for poetic and political and intellectual lyrics to form the basis of song, popular song, chart song. But it was absolutely ice-breaking at the time. And he was the person who did that pretty much single-handedly.
The album title, "Freewheelin' Bob Dylan," that has more than one suggestion of new values, you say. Can you expand on that?
Well, it's another of those things open to interpretation. You could even see it as a sort of sexual thing, because he's portrayed on the front cover with Susie. Very unusual imagery. I mean, some people must have looked at that and maybe not knowing so much about Dylan, because he wasn't that famous then. They might have thought that Susie was Bob, short for Bobby, the female Bobby. It was a very odd piece of iconography. It's become a piece of iconography. But yeah, freewheeling, it just seemed somehow in that odd period, there was the overhang of the McCarthy era, to possibly be charged with political meaning and or sexual meaning.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
The curtain will go up on Act 2 after our short intermission.
Dylan's third studio album is "The Times They Are A-Changin'," released in February of 1964. Almost everything about that album is stark and serious, the humor of freewheeling completely absent. I'm curious as to what you would attribute that to.
I think for a very brief period, he fell in love with this idea of being the voice of a generation. The freewheeling album had given him that image, that aura. And, if you're suddenly having journalists beating a path to your door, nodding sagely as you tell them what you think is wrong with the world, that can turn anybody's heads. He was a young man with plenty of ego and plenty to have a lot of ego about. And I think The Times They Are A-Changing is a very self-conscious album. That's Dylan saying to himself, yes, I am the voice of a generation, and I need to write a certain kind of song in order to underline that fact. And so, whereas the freewheeling Bob Dylan showed a quite rounded human being who, as well as being politically committed, was irreverent and horny and all the rest of it that you would expect to find of a young man in his early 20s, this one was apart from a couple of love songs, it was straight ahead protest music, some of it which was very stark and depressing. The title track is absolutely intoxicating. It's an exhilarating anthem for his generation. And people forget now that in the 60s, the values between the older set and the younger generation was an absolute chasm. So that perfectly summed up that, as much as well as My Generation by The Who. But the rest of it's not exactly enjoyable stuff. And it wasn't necessarily meant to be enjoyable stuff. It's very well crafted, but the political commitment was far more important in those songs than whether or not they were enjoyable songs. And I think even his audience would have agreed with that at the time, because social commentary was very rare in the media in those days.
In early August 1964, Another Side of Bob Dylan was released. This deviated from the socially conscious style of previous albums. What are your thoughts on that?
I think his mind works 5 or 6 times faster than anybody else's. And we all go through this idealistic phase when we're young, and then we grow out of it a little bit and we realize that life is not black and white. We don't lose our sense of compassion necessarily, but we do lose our conviction that there's easy answers to the world's problems. Well, Dylan came to that conclusion, within a year, 18 months of deciding that they were easy answers to the world's problems. That's just how fast he was moving. And he articulates it perfectly in the song My Back Pages, which is on that album. He denounces what he was now calling pejoratively finger-pointing songs. And he denounces lies that life is black and white, to quote from the song. He'd just gone through that phase and he'd come out the other end, and now he was onto something new, which, by the way, doesn't mean that he was doing conventional stuff. The songs on that album, they're still irreverent, they're still alternative. They would have been perceived at the time, if it wasn't for the controversy about him abandoning protest, they would have been conceived as very bohemian songs. He was still a very alternative figure.
For some, the album's closing track, It Ain't Me, Babe, could have been Dylan's anthem. Is it about a woman? Maybe, maybe not. It could be about protesters. Who do you think it could be about?
This will forever be a topic of discussion. Dylan doesn't interpret his songs for us. We have to do that. And many of his songs are very ambiguous. And when he uses the word you, it's quite clear that if you concentrate on the lyrics and you replace the word you with I, he's actually talking about himself. And that even applies to something like To Ramona, which on one level just sounds like a beautiful love song. And it even applies to Like a Rolling Stone, arguably. People have interpreted that as a denouncement of a former lover. But he could just as easily be talking about himself. With regard to It Ain't Me, Babe, it's either a put down of a woman who expects him to behave in a traditional male breadwinner, provider, protector role, or it's a denouncement of the folky protest fans who wanted him to provide answers to the world's problems. So you can take your pick, and it works either way, whichever way you want to listen to it. We should point out, of course, that Babe was his song. It was basically his trademark. It is now part of the common lexicon. But he was the first person to put that in popular song, which a couple of years later, or it was the following year, wasn't it? It led to You Got Me, Babe, Sonny and Cher. And a lot of people, when they first heard that song, they thought it was either Bob Dylan or a cover of a Bob Dylan song, because that word was so bound up in his image. Plus the melody line is a very Dylan-esque melody line for the period. Again, it's one of these things that have been forgotten by history.
This episode's guest is Sean Egan, the author of Decade of Dissent, How 1960s Bob Dylan Changed the World. 60 years ago this month, Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home was released, April 1965. His first album to incorporate electric instrumentation. Side 1 electric, Side 2 mainly acoustic, Subterranean Homesick Blues, Maggie's Farm, Mr. Tambourine Man from this album. The title refers to, I suppose, Dylan returning to his rock and roll roots, but you say the title has been interpreted in several ways. What's the most common interpretation?
Well, people assume that the title is Dylan saying the Beatles have reinvigorated and recalibrated rock and roll, but now Dylan is bringing it back to the land where it originated. We'll never know, of course, because he'll never interpret that for us. But that's the common assumption, and it seems a reasonable assumption. It does seem logical to assume that that was because he was running a real big risk of alienating his old fans by embracing rock. It wasn't necessarily the case that pop fans and rock fans would buy his records, because there'd never been a pop or rock artist like him writing lyrics like his. So it does seem to be a hedge betting exercise. The ironic thing, of course, is that the second half of the album, the acoustic, folky side, is easily the superior side. I mean, it's got 4 epic classics, including Mr. Tambourine Man, but also including It's All Right Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, which may well be his greatest ever song. Although the first side does have Subterranean Homesick Blues, which is a rock record like no other. It sounds a bit like Chuck Berry, but Chuck Berry, as though he's decided to suddenly go all political and streetwise instead of writing these anthems celebrating rock and roll.
It's All Right Ma, lyrically, he's just brilliant on that song.
And that's the point where Bob Dylan, the poet, truly starts, with songs like that, especially that. I mean, his first few albums, he'd been poetic. He'd been colloquial, first of all, and he'd moved into a more elliptical style of writing, such as on Chimes of Freedom. But suddenly you can look at the lyrics that he's writing and you think to yourself, if I saw that on a printed page, I might conclude that was written by Verlaine or Rimbaud or any of the great poets. It's beautiful phraseology, very intricate rhyming schemes, and he's learning about construction of songs as well, because he doesn't just end arbitrarily on a verse that could have been in any part of the song. He builds to a climax, and the last verse is usually a big statement and a big concluding point. So he is really learning his songcraft.
Like a Rolling Stone is the lead track on the next album, which is considered among the greatest ever recorded, if not the greatest, 1965's Highway 61 Revisited. You do write about the ways that Like a Rolling Stone was groundbreaking. Talk about that. This was unprecedented in that it's over 6 minutes long.
And it was released as a single. He stood his ground on that. He demanded that it not be cut. We were talking about his poetry just now, but this is a very colloquial, gritty, streetwise song, albeit with that ambiguity to it, because Dylan works on so many levels. It's absolutely venomous song. It's got this refrain of "How does it feel?" which is almost like a childhood taunt, and you almost feel guilty for enjoying the malice in this song. But it's the kind of song that had never been heard before. It got to number 1 on the Cashboard charts, only number 2 on Billboard, and the trouble is nobody remembers Cashbox anymore. But it was effectively a number 1 single. And for a record like that to go to number 1, that showed that popular music and the culture were changing profoundly.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
When? Oh, patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Blonde on Blonde, released in June of 1966. One of Us Must Know Sooner or Later, Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35. I Want You, Just Like a Woman, Leopard Skin Pill Box Hat are the 5 singles. There's a quote from the book. It's dated 1978, and this is something that Dylan had said. He said, quote, "The closest I ever got to the sound I hear in my mind was on individual bands in the Blonde on Blonde album. It's that thin, that wild Mercury sound. It's metallic and bright gold, with whatever that conjures up. That's my particular sound." When he says individual bands, I believe he's referring to the different bands that he recorded the songs with for this album.
That's interesting. I've always interpreted that bands in that quote as meaning cuts, tracks. But you've actually, maybe you're right, actually. Maybe that's what he did mean. It had a very awkward gestation. He was using the Hawks, later to become the band. They were his backing band on that tour that he embarked on in 65, 66, going around the world and being booed to the rafters by the folkies in the audience who didn't like the fact that he'd, quote, sold out by going rock and roll. Although his name is inextricably linked to the band now because of that tour, because of the basement tapes, because of the tour 74 where they went on tour together after an 8-year hiatus. They just weren't getting it together in the studio for the tracks that would eventually appear on the album that became Blonde on Blonde. His producer actually said to him, Bob Johnston, "Look, why don't you come down to Nashville," which is where Bob usually recorded, because they've got great musicians there and they can nail a song instantly. Now, that might sound like a banal and trivial suggestion today, but you just didn't do that in those days. If you were, although he came from Minnesota, he was now a New York hipster and very much seen to be on the left in society. Whereas Nashville, the Deep South and everything, that was considered to be very much on the right. As I say, there was a big schism in society in those days. Not just old and young, but northern and southern. But Dylan didn't care about those things, and he didn't care that he was treading over sacred ground. He took up the suggestion. They decamped to Nashville. He brought with him Robbie Robertson from the band and Al Cooper, who played on Highway 61 and famously on Like a Rolling Stone. But the rest of the musicians were the musos who you found on Music Row, and they turned out to be as good as Bob Johnston's word. He was presenting them with these weird songs, with these weird lengths and these weird signatures and incredibly weird lyrics, and they just went with the flow, and what resulted is what many people consider to be Dylan's masterpiece. A double album, came out in 66. The world is divided between people who think Highway 61 Revisited is Dylan's masterpiece and people who think Blonde on Blonde is his masterpiece. Highway 61 is a much more in the round album. It's got tracks like Desolation Row on it and Tombstone Blues, which look at the injustices in the world. Whereas Blonde on Blonde, the songs are really all about Bob Dylan. So you can take your pick.
The title Blonde on Blonde, there are various theories behind that. What are some of the common interpretations of that title?
It could be nothing more banal than the fact that the initials spell out Bob. Dylan's a sort of mischievous character, and he'll have known that people were interpreting his stuff, even at that early stage. But again, we'll never know because Dylan is not the kind of person who safes that stuff. We just have to interpret it. It's probably not that important. It's just a title. It can be annoying if you're researching Bob Dylan because you'll find he'll say something about one project one album, one event in his life, and then he'll completely contradict himself in another interview. You know, believe it or not, I've seen quotes from him where he says that Self-Portrait, his 1970 album, is a great album, whereas most people think not only is it his worst album, but one of the worst albums ever made. And in fact, he's given quotes that suggest that he thinks it's one of the worst albums ever made, and that he deliberately made it so in order to get rid of all the fanatical fans who were at the time pestering him.
A greatest hits album released March of '67 while Dylan retreated from the public eye to recover from a motorcycle accident. Sometime between March and June of '67, he started jamming on songs with the members of the band. And then December 1967, he returned with his 8th studio album, John Wesley Harding. This includes All Along the Watchtower. You write, quote, "The unprecedentedly long 18-month gap between albums had created a mystique around him that only made the reception to the record even more reverential than it would have been in the ordinary course of events." Do you feel at this point Dylan was trying to distance himself from being the voice of a generation, or had he already been trying to do that?
Yeah, well, he'd been doing that ever since 1964. He was trying to distance himself also from Albert Grossman, his manager, who'd given him this grueling schedule, which he went along with quite willingly, being very ambitious. But those 3 albums that we mentioned, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde, they're referred to by Dylan fans as the amphetamine rock trilogy. You can interpret that and understand precisely why. You can't maintain, 14 months he released those 3 albums in, plus he was still touring. You can't maintain that kind of schedule without, and plus he was being booed to the rafters, which must have had a psychological effect on him. You can't maintain that without some artificial stimulant. And then he was due to go on another world tour when Blonde on Blonde had just been released. He could possibly have ended up dead if that had gone ahead. He came off his motorbike while riding the back roads of Woodstock, where he now lived. And he just basically exploited that to cry off all commitments. He exaggerated how injured he was. And Grossman said, well, if you're not going to tour and you're not going to record, can you at least write some songs that I can sell to other recording artists? Because he was the most covered recording artist, the most covered songwriter in the world at that point. Everybody wanted to record a Bob Dylan song. So that leads to the basement tapes, where he just slaps down in the basement with musty acoustics these quirky new songs that he's writing. They're not just quirky, they're also full of self-reflection, condemnations of somebody, an authority figure that seems to be Grossman, but also condemnations of himself, because he hadn't exactly been a benign figure over the last couple of years in his treatment of people. And then, although the public don't get to hear those songs except as cover versions, they get to hear similar songs on John Wesley Harding. The John Wesley Harding songs don't have the humour of the basement tape songs, and they don't have the sexual content of those songs, but they're all basically songs that trace a journey from idolatry to humility, and then finally domestic bliss. And it's really a concept album, although it doesn't get mentioned in the same breath as things like Tommy and Quadrophenia. It is definitely a concept album.
His last album of the 60s was a country album, and that's 1969's Nashville Skyline, which features Lay Lady Lay and Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You. There's also the re-recording of Girl from North Country with Johnny Cash. And there's a quote in the book that's really interesting I want to ask you about, Sean. You write, quote, "In a way, if Nashville Skyline had been his final long player, it would have been a perfect ending to Bob Dylan's career." Can you talk about why you feel that way?
Well, it traces a journey because Nashville Skyline sees him embracing domestic bliss. It also sees him embracing the kind of banal songwriting that he'd been the antidote to his entire career so far. He basically wearied of political commitment, he'd wearied of celebrity, he'd wearied of his own behaviour when he was drunk on fame for a couple of years. And he's now married, he's got a brood of children, and all he's interested in doing is celebrating that. I mean, you mentioned 3 of the songs on the album. They're probably the only decent songs. Lay Lady Lay is a classic, and it showed that he could pull it out of the hat when he still tried. But the rest of them are banal, and in hindsight, looking through the prism of self-portrait, probably deliberately banal. He was trying to portray a different image while keeping his hand in as a recording artist. It's an odd album, and it does trace that trajectory of being ambitious, achieving his ambitions, writing great songs, and then wearying of everything that was attached to that rise into the stratosphere. So it would have been a really interesting way to end his career. But unfortunately, if he had ended his career like that, it would have suggested that he'd sort of been beaten by life, that he'd been beaten down by everything, and he'd abandoned any kind of intellectual capability. But it certainly ended one phase of his life.
Decade of Descent, How 1960s Bob Dylan Changed the World. It's out now. You could find it wherever books are sold. Also look for it at your nearest independent bookstore. You can go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest bookstore. Sean Egan, thank you.
Nice to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
That's it. It's in the books.